Great. Again, my name is Catherine Morris. I'm with the Consensus Building Institute, and this is meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Steering Committee. And so welcome both council steering committee members as well as public joining us. We are going to have some public comments at the end of the meeting. Appreciate you listening in and giving us your feedback then. And for that, I'll just turn it over to Secretary Clauser to open us up.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. Jane, I don't know if you want to, have you attached the agenda to the chat?
I placed the agenda in the chat and the minutes are linked in there as well, but I can get a direct link to the minutes.
Great. Okay, so we'll, Jane will walk us through an approval of the May 2nd minutes, and then we will, the vast majority of today will be the work planning for the steering committee, and Jane and Catherine will take us through that. After we hopefully develop a summer work plan, we will move on to update on contractual work from Jane, and then we will review and approve new subcommittee members at 12:30. And then set meeting dates for July, August, and September. After that, we'll end with public comment and adjourn, if all goes well, at 1 o'clock or earlier. Any changes or amendments to that agenda?
Not seeing anybody raising their hand, so I think we might be good to go.
Great, and Jane has attached the meeting minutes, so we can walk through approval of those next.
So does anyone either need more time or have any corrections to the May 2nd meeting minutes? Couple thumbs up. All right. All right, well, great. Then we'll consider the meeting minutes approved. And with that, we will go ahead and jump into the first agenda item, which is the work planning for the steering committee. I went back and did listen into your discussion. I understand that this was raised and this time was really put on the agenda so that you could have a good amount of time to work together to think about the coming summer and beyond, and think about your work, not only the work that you have, but how you are working to support the council. So we put on the agenda sort of a couple of key questions to get this started and to get you thinking sort of like what does success look like this year? And, you know, in terms of what kind of milestones you might have met by the end of the summer. And we also hope that, you know, in addition, we can really sketch out the next couple of steering committee meetings, you know, down to the agenda items to actually operationalize what that success looks like. So you'll see a couple of sub bullets that were in the agenda, kind of outlining some of the drivers, at least for your work planning, which included both changes or addendums that you would need to be making to the climate action plan. The two moving parts there are both the transportation, the biomass task groups that are going to be making some suggestions for changes and are doing their own outreach. There's also the issue of budget priorities, and I understand that that's something that's going to come up as soon as October. So the question for you is whether or not you want to have some direct input on the administration's budget in advance of that. And then finally, the legislative priorities. I think, Jared, this is something that you brought up at the last meeting, is how does this group, in light of both what has passed and what didn't pass in the legislature, want to take some initiative to provide recommendations on legislative actions. So those are the three main parts of the work plan. We're going to talk about what kind of needs to support that in terms of what you might need in terms of resources, as well as any input you might want to get from the public engagement process that will be ongoing for all of those topics. So before I turn it over questions, let me ask if Jane, you want to just say anything more about that or expand.
No, I actually, you did a great job, Catherine. So thanks so much. And I think we can take it one through three and as we go. And so I'd love to just engage with the steering committee around that first question that Catherine's highlighted so well, and then start to think about what's needed to get us there. And then also, whenever is most appropriate for you all, I'm happy to highlight that public engagement efforts that we're currently underway with, and talk about how they can be most helpful in the work of the council this fall.
Great. So Chris and Jared, you both, your hands went up very quickly. So let me let you get in there before we get into the responses. Maybe you have some questions. Chris?
Yeah, I just I should know, but I don't. Do we know when do the House appointed members' terms end?
Yep, they end in October.
Okay.
Yes, and that's something, Chris, I've been meaning to speak with you and Liz about offline, to think about how to engage with the legislature, the Committee on Committees over the summer, to think about that with respect to the timeline and the work plan this fall.
Jared?
Thanks, Catherine. Just to take a step back before diving in terms of overall context, I just, that first bullet being around, addendums or addenda to the climate action plan. I really wish we were at a point where we, the recommendations of the climate action plan had been accepted and moved forward, and we were really talking about kind of what is next, what are the additional things that we should be doing. But I think we have to start the conversation with a recognition that many of the recommendations in the climate action plan have not moved forward, and that it's not just about adding new things, it's about how do we get the recommendations that were already in there to move forward. And so I just want us to have space for that conversation. I know it's a difficult conversation, but to me, it's very clear that the situation we're in is that the climate action plan doesn't come close to adding up to our responsibility to meet the legal requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so, yes, the forthcoming transportation policy recommendations that that are kind of, we've been holding multiple webinars to discuss that, will be teed up for a council decision by November. That will be helpful, but with key recommendations in the climate action plan, from the clean heat standard to vehicle efficiency price adjustments to others just not not moving forward, I think that presents planning questions for us as a steering committee and as a council. I think it also presents legal questions that I don't know the answer to, but I think we all need to figure out. So I'll just leave it there for now, but I just think it needs to be said that we can't just talk about new things to do when the very baseline initial things that we pointed to haven't been done.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Jared. And so your advice would be, as we go through and think about the milestones that we're thinking, and this probably goes in large part to the legislative discussion as well, is think about things that didn't happen and things that weren't taken up, as well as additional new items.
That's right.
Yeah, well said. Any other comments? I think we wanted to start this sort of more broadly, but with the question of, what does success look like? And I think that means, what at the end of this year does success look like to you, in terms of not only what the council has completed, but what maybe, as to Jared's point, what action has been taken up on the council's recommendations. And what have you done or accomplished in order to make that happen? So is that a fair enough start to this? I think we do want to get ultimately into the nitty gritty of, how does this translate into your agendas for the next few meetings? But let's start out more broadly for the moment. Lauren.
Yeah, I just want to second what Jared said and then also add to your summary of that, the legal implications. I don't know if that means we need to have somebody from somewhere, whether it's legislative council or something, A&R council, come and tell us how far we are from meeting the 2025 and 2030 goals or requirements, and making sure that we understand the implications of missing those marks.
Jane, can you say where that kind of clarity would come from? Who would
Yeah,
come to speak to them?
yeah. A&R's legal counsel would be the ones to provide a legal memo on that, as they provide legal support to the council, but the council is not a client of A&R's attorney. So Julie's just walking in and can actually probably speak to a little bit of the nuance of that relationship, but yeah, there could be a legal memo provided on the components of meeting the statutory requirements.
Okay. So we have, thinking about both additional updates to the climate action plan, which we've already acknowledged in the transportation biomass, thinking about things that haven't been taken up already, that are in the plan already that haven't been taken up with follow-up implementation action, and then sort of a better, clearer understanding of some of the legal ramifications if the overall the goals aren't met of the council's plan. So those are, yeah, Jared, you want to add in on what does success look like, or you want to clarify?
Yeah, no, I think that I appreciate what Lauren said and what Jane offered. Just one friendly amendment to what Lauren said is, I may have misheard you, Lauren, but I think that what we want from the legal analysis is the legal implications of the plan not adding up. I think the analysis of to what degree the plan falls short is, the type of work that the council through cross-sector and science and data and through our consultants can and should do, and certainly have done some of already. But to me, I would very much appreciate seeing A&R's analysis of the legal implications and options given the kind of untenable situation that we are in right now. But I don't think that that's sufficient. I think that A&R legal counsel is in a unique and difficult situation where they are not counsel to the council, they're counsel to A&R, and that we may need additional legal analysis for the council that can be, broader, more independent, whether that is through the Attorney General's office or through other legal expertise. I think it'll be important to balance that out because we are in an untenable situation where the plan that was adopted has been opposed, some of the core elements of it, and is not moving forward, and we're not on track to the legal requirements. So we need to know what that means legally and what the options for different parties are, whether that's A&R, the council, and others.
Jane, did you? Nope, she went out.
No, we're here. We're just, hold on. We're just having technical difficulties with two people in the same room.
Okay. I want to hear from others. So, we have these three drivers of the work plan. Any other things you want to see, you're sure are covered by the end of, at least the end of the summer, going into the fall and the legislative process and budget process? Or anything specific you'd like to see coming out, particularly of the recommendations around the budget? Yeah, Liz.
Hi, sorry for being off camera before. I was dealing with an old dog and also transitioning from work back to home for that. But I've been listening. Two things. One is with respect to what Jared and Lauren raised, wondering also whether the conversation could be framed around timeline, because at least one of the recommendations on clean heat strikes me as one that's likely to come up in the legislature again. And depending upon the timeline for implementation, I don't want to say, you know, everything will be fine, but there was already quite a bit of time built into the piece that was considered this last session. And while it didn't get across the finish line, depending upon how that were to be taken up again, it just feels like that should be part of the analysis, because I think I've heard Jane say, and I personally agree with this, the climate action plan stands as it is with a set of recommendations that you know, the majority of the council stood behind. And I think that's as true today as it was when it was passed. So that may be worth keeping in mind as we think about the implications of pieces not moving forward. And the second thing is just wanting to make sure that I put it on the table for this steering committee. The biomass subcommittee, task group rather, has a question that it wanted to pose to the steering committee on scope. And Jane, I don't know if you were planning to bring that up later. I just want to make sure it gets raised
Yes,
during the
it is.
meeting.
It is on our
Okay, great.
agenda at the
Great. Yeah,
end.
I saw it. Oh, we can do it at the end. Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Liz a clarification on your first point, which is the timeline issue? I heard you say, you know, the council's plan is there. It represents the council's plan. I wasn't quite clear on what you were asking in terms of the, you know, what this steering committee should address.
Yeah, thanks,
the
Catherine.
timeline.
Some of those who probably followed the clean heat are more aware than I, but in essence, the plan that was considered by the legislature and initially passed and vetoed and not overridden had a timeline for implementation that was, I don't know, 2 to 3 years. And then obviously goals ramping up beyond that. So point being that, you know, legislation, you know, difficult things often take time, right? And while it didn't get across in one session, that doesn't mean that refinements to a similar policy wouldn't get through in another. And depending upon the timeline for implementation thereafter, the recommendations of the climate action plan may indeed still be the ones that would, you know, kind of govern, or whatever you want to call it.
Got it. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, this is probably not something that we can discuss here now and may not be appropriate, but I just know I have an interest in seeing the Global Warming Solutions Act amended to elevate adaptation and resilience to have the same level of priority as greenhouse gas reduction. So I'm just personally, I'm going to be exploring that, but I don't know if that's something we should talk about as a group this summer or not as a council, or maybe that's something that those of us who are interested in working on that work on. So just wanted to bring that up though.
So would it be appropriate for that conversation to fall under the legislative priorities discussion?
Probably if folk feel it's appropriate to do that. I'm not really sure about amending the act being how that jibes with the actual work of the council. So that's why I was giving that kind of escape clause there.
Okay, well, we'll put a holding place for it, at least for now. Jared.
On that second bullet point around budget priorities, I agree that that is an important part of the work plan. One thing that would be, I think, really helpful as part of that discussion has already been identified, which is a kind of presentation on the timeline and process that the administration will go through, and ANR in particular. One thing I think would be a really helpful addition to that conversation, and I just wanted to see if we could get a brief update at some point from Jane or Secretary Moore, is the status of the marginal abatement cost curve. Because, you know, one of the key rationales for doing that analysis was to say, okay, here are all of the different emissions reduction measures that were identified in the pathways analysis. And on their own, it can't tell us where to invest money, but it helps us know from a cost effectiveness perspective, dollars spent per ton of pollution reduced, where are some of the most, we have an initial sense of some of those highest impact, biggest bang for the buck investments because of some initial analysis that the PSD and the EAN have done, but that would be really helpful information to have added to that process. So at some point, it would be good to just get an update on, you know, what the revised timeline is. I think we had one, you know, that it had been extended because of contracting challenges. And I just want to make sure that that doesn't get lost as we do the timelining and planning around the budget priorities.
Okay, so great. That would be like an additional, making sure that we have time and the resources to put towards that analysis of kind of where the best impact is of future investments under the climate action plan. Kristen, Secretary Clauser.
Thanks, and Kristen's fine. So I just wanted to, and maybe this isn't the right time, but I just wanted to kind of circle back and get some clarification on a point that Jared made earlier about securing, you know, independent legal counsel for the council. Jared, it sounded like what you were asking is a legal review for kind of what the legal implications of not meeting the targets within the Global Warming Solutions Act are, which I think we discussed is something that ANR's general counsel or legal counsel can certainly provide. What's unclear to me is what legal analysis you're looking for kind of over and above that, because it just seems to me that, you know, the legal implications of not meeting the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act is something we can answer. And then how to proceed from there seems to be a substantive question, not a legal one. But maybe I'm just not quite understanding what legal analysis you're looking for. So I just wanted some clarification.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't, I wouldn't presume to know exactly the questions that need to be answered, but I guess where I was coming from is a recognition that the Agency of Natural Resources has a unique set of kind of considerations under the Global Warming Solutions Act in terms of, you know, being the agency that if the recommendations don't move forward is directed to commence rulemaking to make sure that the emissions reduction requirements are met. And so, you know, I think that ANR is likely going to, I mean, I don't want to speak for them, correct me, or please expand on this, Secretary Moore, but, you know, my sense is that a lot of the legal analysis that the Agency of Natural Resources is going to have to do is what does that new or additional rulemaking and processes and timelines have to look like so that ANR can comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act, since the recommendations in the climate action plan are not moving forward on the timeline that the council recommended to, you know, to do our best shot of meeting the requirements laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so I don't know who the appropriate entities are to do some of the analysis, but I think some of the key questions are, you know, what are the responsibilities of the council in this moment, and what are the potential avenues of recourse, given that, you know, we're in this untenable situation where the plan was passed overwhelmingly by the council and its recommendations haven't moved forward. I think Liz makes a good point that there's still a possibility that those recommendations could move forward in the next year and we could get back on track. But I think it is important to pause and say, as of now, given what we know now, where we stand today, we're not on track. And that leads to some thorny questions of being out of compliance with the law. And I'll just say, I should say explicitly, my view is different than the view that I've heard from some in the administration. I've heard a view that we don't, from some in the administration, that we don't need to worry about not complying with the Global Warming Solutions Act until at least 2027, given the delays in emissions reporting. It would only be a retrospective after the fact analysis. And I don't agree with that. I think we know now, given the analysis and projections on a forward-looking basis, whether or not that we can have some degree of confidence that the plan will add up to meeting the 2025 requirements. And given everything we know now, I have a very low degree. I think it's almost impossible that having many of those recommendations not moving forward, that we could be on track to 2030. That's not to say something couldn't change next year, but I do think that I want to know as a counselor, and I want to be able to have the whole council and every counselor know, you know, what does this mean for us? This between this untenable situation where we've put a plan forward that can meet our legal requirements, but it hasn't been acted on. And I think there's more specific questions under that. But that's the general dynamic that I want to understand. I do think it would be helpful to hear from ANR, you know, what their plans are in terms of commencing rulemaking, given the fact that key pieces of legislation didn't move forward, and what ANR's legal analysis about ANR's responsibilities are. But I think there's a bigger question beyond ANR that is probably better addressed or additionally addressed by other legal counsel. And it may include the Attorney General's office. I don't know.
All right, thanks for that clarification, Jared. I want to sort of make sure, I mean, we've already started touching on the sub questions here on, you know, what kind of foundational presentations would you need? What kind of resources do you need to actually do this work? One being this legal or institutional pathways that you have to move forward on. The other one that you raised, Jared, was some additional analysis that would give you some way to prioritize budget investments. And then you've also touched on a couple of ideas about, you know, the legislative initiatives you might want to be thinking about, and teeing up for some kind of input to the legislature. Both the Clean Heat Standard was raised, the changes to the Global Warming Solutions Act, along with the biomass and transportation recommendations that are coming out of those subgroups. So hit on a lot of those. I want to make sure that we touch on both, again, any additional resources or analysis you would want to see supporting to help you make those kinds of, have those conversations. And two, there is a specific question here about, I think there's whether or not this group wants to weigh in on the res. And that works going forward, I guess, under the commission, the Public Service Commission, and what role you want to take up there. So I'm just teeing up a couple more questions for discussion to make sure we don't let anything fall through the cracks here when we put together this work plan. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the room. Julie and Jane.
But yes, since you alluded to the public engagement around the res and the collaboration with Public Service Department, I thought I might just provide that some context. That was really listed out as a laundry list and explanation of the ongoing public engagement that the Council's Public Engagement Task Group and the Agency of Natural Resources have lifted up as priorities over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. And so I want to highlight what those are in broad context, so that you have an understanding of what Catherine's referring to with the res. And so on the list, I just want to say that the public engagement strategy continues to be focused in and around both accessibility of the plan and those components of making the plan more accessible through translation and online storytelling, mapping, as well as press and outgoing work that we've been doing internally at ANR. And then our actual engagement with Vermonters has really been focused first on broad-based engagement and then second on partner engagement. And that partner engagement has really been the focus and will continue to be the focus of the public engagement task group. And not much has changed in that space other than to advance certain conversations with the partner organizations we're working with, which we presented to you all on at the council meeting last month. But specifically in the space of broad-based engagement, we've been thinking about where to put our limited capacity, knowing that we held our 2 meetings a month or so ago, focused specifically on this question of work planning with Vermonters, but don't want that to be the end of the listening sessions and communication we do with Vermonters. And so have been thinking about strategic priorities. And the work has really focused and will continue to focus on a couple of buckets. One, first and foremost, is we're obligated under the GWSA to do robust public engagement for any rules that are advanced out of the climate action plan. And as you all know, we're moving forward with advancing Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. And so we have a commitment to working with the public engagement task group and others to flesh out a strategic plan for how we will implement that public engagement, which is highlighted around frontline and impacted communities and supposed to be delivered statewide. So that is something that we're thinking about in the next month or so to actually plan for the month of September, which the earliest we could do is in middle of August based on the timeline with the filing of the rules. And so we're going to hold back and actually work on that engagement in September once summer vacations and people and kids are back in school. The second component of what that broad-based engagement looks like has been around implementation components of the climate action plan. So Marion's been doing an excellent job with the climate toolkit group and really thinking about targeted stakeholder engagement to ensure the climate toolkit is lifted up and the most helpful it can be for the targeted audience. And the municipal vulnerability index that we're moving forward with now through the RFP that's posted will have a large stakeholder engagement component as the first phase of it. And then finally, we've been working closely with the Public Service Department, and TJ I see has come on screen in thinking about anticipated legislative priorities next session. There's a lot of interest from constituents around bringing up the res next year. And we've been thinking about the need to do public engagement on the front end, not only to inform res, but perhaps to be able to bring forward to the legislature the need to pause and not bring forward the res and think more strategically about how we go deeper and broader with on the public engagement around the res to demonstrate the need to continue that work before taking it up in the legislative capacity. So why don't I pause there, and TJ, if you want to speak particularly to the plan that the Public Service Department has been putting together. That's one component that we'll be talking about actually right after this. We have a public engagement meeting with that where Claire from the Public Service Department is joining us to think about what listening sessions could look like around the res coming this late summer into the fall.
Right. Thanks, Jane. And I'll just chime in on just renewable energy policy in general was a really big part of the comprehensive energy plan as well. This is why this is framed as coordinating with the Public Service Department's efforts here. And the Jane framed it up as the RES, the Renewable Energy Standard, which is kind of shorthand for that, but it's really broader than just the Renewable Energy Standard. It the energy plan contemplates reviewing our renewable energy policy more broadly, including the complementary programs that feed into the renewable energy standard, like net metering or the standard offer program, and how all of those integrate and move forward. The climate action plan's recommendation was really a lot more focused on 100% renewable energy or 100% clean energy. And so the energy plan's perspective was a little bit broader there. And I would just want to draw out that distinction. But in moving forward, we want to recognize that, you know, these plans are relatively consistent on in going forward, but that there is opportunity here to, you know, the urgency in the electric sector is not necessarily the same as it is in the transport and thermal sectors. And we want to take the opportunity to kind of do this right and leverage, as far as the department is concerned, leverage the resources of the council and the engagement possibilities here. This is why, as Jane said, Claire is at this meeting directly following this one to really share, you know, how we're thinking about going forward with an engagement process and thinking about development of a path forward in this sector. And that could take a couple of different tracks. There's, you know, there's a possibility to kind of, as Jane said, at least last year, I think things have changed over the last couple of months, but at least last year, there was some desire to get something on the books, get, you know, pass some legislation, move something forward in this area. And we could do a process that runs 6 months, has something ready for the 2023 legislative session. Or we could do, you know, kind of walk the walk of what we've been talking about with public engagement, procedural equity, and really bringing people in and listening and hearing kind of what's important to stakeholders and a much broader set of stakeholders, and have a thorough process that maybe takes a little longer, but gets us to a better spot in the end. And so we'll be talking about kind of those couple of options going forward and how we think about that. And we want to fully engage the Climate Council in that process, given the overlap in the recommendations. So I guess I'll stop there, and hopefully that was enough additional color for this this group. One other thing I'll mention is I would expect to bring this up in the cross-sector mitigation committee as well going forward, and just have input through that process, and Claire's working in the Just Transitions Committee and their work group process as well. So kind of as far as the council's concerned, I think that those are the points of interconnection, and then outwardly working together on engagement.
So is it fair to say, Jane, that what we need today, at least in terms of feedback from the steering committee, is more about how much of a priority this should take within the work plan, you know, where it sits, whether or not we need to have a specific recommendation for the legislature?
My understanding and expectation was really around demonstrating the public engagement that we have prepared to do, and the limited capacity that we have to do anything additional in that space. So really thinking about the public engagement that we're committed to, and thinking about how that can and should inform the work priorities of the council this fall. So I don't actually need any recommendation in this space right now, really, other than for folks to be aware that this is the kind of engagement that we're doing with Vermonters, and think creatively about how it can plug in and actually be useful in the work of the council going forward.
Okay, thanks for that. Jared.
Well, thank you, Jane and TJ. You know, I definitely think that the renewable energy standard can and should be updated, at least along the broad outlines of 100% renewable or 100% carbon free that the council made in the climate action plan recommendation. And, you know, to borrow Chris's phrase from the chat, that we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and that should be able to move forward. At the same time, especially given that you were just talking about limited resources and kind of how to prioritize public engagement efforts, Jane, and because, you know, the legislature and the administration may have limited bandwidth in terms of what can be focused on, I think it can also be important to prioritize, as we did in the climate action plan, which recommendations are actually likely to deliver, you know, significant benefits in terms of pollution reduction and cost reduction. And I just want to make sure that as we advance a conversation about the res, we're doing that in addition to, not instead of or crowding out the two most important conversations that I think need to happen and that we agreed to in the climate action plan with our order of recommendations, which is transportation sector policy and heating sector policy. So if this is in addition to continuing the clean heat standard conversation, advancing the transportation policy recommendation or recommendations that come in November, that's great. But given that 3/4 of our emissions come from transportation and thermal, I wouldn't want us to say that's hard, so we're going to move to this sector that's 2% of our emissions. There are benefits to updating the res. We can and should do it, but the priority needs to remain as was discussed and recommended in the CAP. And that, to me, I just want to be clear, is first and foremost on transportation and thermal sector policy.
Great. I'm sort of hearing that consistently. Having just heard that there is limited capacity, there are plans to have a little bit broader engagement along with these targeted partnership conversations, and the transportation subgroup is having their own set of public engagement activities. A little nervous about asking, but is there any other focus area that you would suggest that any of this broader public engagement consider taking up, in addition to what they've already agreed to do? Anybody have any advice for how to, structure those on a particular topic? Okay. Well, one of the things we wanted to try to actually translate this conversation into, we wanted to narrow it down into a really kind of a clear idea of what you wanted to take on in the next couple of steering committee meetings. As I understand it, are probably going to be meeting monthly. I think that's something we're going to define at the end of the meeting, but to the extent we know we got at least a couple more meetings over the course of the summer. I wonder if it would be helpful if we could just think about what comes first. What is it that we need to be focusing on, say, for our next meeting that would be most helpful? Is it, we know we have in our timeline that there is both the budget priorities coming up fairly quickly, and as well as the legislature getting back in gear. If we can walk and chew gum at the same time, I'm sure we can take on multiple topics at the same time. So wanted to just find out, if we were crafting right here and now the agenda for the next meeting, what would you want to see there? What would help you get started? Jared?
One really important piece of context that I would request for presentation from ANR would be what ANR's plans are for new rulemaking to commence or move forward to make the cap add up, since the legislative recommendations have not moved forward, and on what timeline. I think that's information that we need to know to be able to think about the rest of the timelines and priorities.
Julie unmuted me, and as you are speaking, Jared, and others thinking about this, I just wanted to highlight that what feels a little different about this for me for work planning for the steering committee this summer is we're thinking for the first time, this committee is really being used to think really thoughtfully about process for the fall for the council to advance work. So I guess I would ask you a couple things. One, what is needed in between meetings, the independent work perhaps of counselors and others to think about what the process and plan looks like for the council this fall to A, develop a set of budget priorities, B, move to deciding around addendums for transportation and biomass or anything else. So there's this question of process that we've not done with you all before. It goes beyond just setting agendas and thinking about what are things that you want to learn and understand to set those processes in place, and then how that work is going to actually be advanced, so that come fall, we have a productive suite of meetings with the council to actually set in motion priorities and prioritization, which I would argue has been challenging for the council in the past.
So Jane, can you give us a sense of when this is maybe only for me because I haven't been part of the meetings in the past, but when the subgroup, the transportation and biomass subgroups are likely to kind of come forward with some recommendations? Will that be very late in the summer, early fall?
Yes.
Okay. So that work is ongoing between meetings. So that's one piece. It has its own life and is moving forward. And what I'm hearing you ask is, what else needs to happen that this members of the steering committee can actually kind of put their nose to and kind of get organized around the budget, the legislative issues that are coming up, particularly.
Yeah, I think that's really right, Catherine. I think that there is a clear process for biomass and transportation via the task groups first and foremost, and then the subcommittees to advance recommendations up to the council, not dissimilar from how the council absorbed information for the climate action plan. And we will be able to do that this fall in a timely manner from the subcommittees up to the council, and then decisions can be made similarly to how we adopted or didn't adopt recommendations for the CAP. My question is really around, is there some information, understanding that you all want to see at a July and August meeting around budget and or prioritization process for legislative that would help you determine what a schedule or a set of meetings could look like this fall for the larger council to digest information? And that would be that would be helpful.
And we've heard a few of those. So we have heard, so this budget analysis about, or the analysis about the around the climate actions themselves, and which ones kind of bring us the biggest bang for the buck as a starting place for prioritizing. Others? Yeah.
Just on that point, the delay in getting to that analysis is sort of a legal contractual problem that we are sorting through right now. The Stockholm Environmental Institute is obviously located outside of the bounds of this country. And it triggers some fairly esoteric, honestly, contracting provisions, and we just haven't been able to navigate through. I don't have a timeline for seeing that resolved, unfortunately. No, we're working on it, and we agree that this is an important data set that we want to have available. But we've got a little bit more legwork we need to do to get to that point. So I'm optimistic we'll have that information. We have a contractor that stands ready to do the analysis, but we just need to sort of open up the door to be able to work with them. And yeah, so it's coming. I just can't commit to when.
Okay, so we don't have a timeline, but eventually that information will be available, hopefully.
Yes.
Other specific information or deliberations that this group would need to take on to meet Jane's request? Anything else? You can imagine spending your time together, either discussing, reviewing, or being more informed about. Somebody had mentioned, I think, maybe this was actually in the last meeting because I was just reviewing that right beforehand, but sort of what, I don't know if you've had the time to really look at the legislative, what actually transpired over the course of the legislative session, what has kind of was left on the cutting floor, and where are the gaps you see? Have you had time to review that? Is that something that would be helpful? Just to set aside some time together to go over that?
I think it would be helpful to do that.
Others agree? Anybody else see that as being useful? Use of your next meeting or the following meeting? If I'm missing anything in the chat, let me know, but okay, well, I think part of the other question is to your point, Jane, what is the process look like? Do you have a sense that it's worthwhile to set up like a subgroup to maybe do some of that preparatory work on either the legislative agenda or the budget questions that need to be addressed? So I think that's what goes on in between. I don't know if Jane, you have a suggestion or.
Yeah, what I want to say is that I think that anything around budget prioritization or legislative priorities needs to be driven by the council and the steering committee. And so that's sort of what I've been trying to get at, is that I think that if that work needs to be advanced and there's a process or a prioritization that needs to happen, that the council should drive that work. And that whether that means an independent task group or what, I haven't, yeah. I see Secretary Clauser has her hand up, so she.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. She would have a good approach on the budgeting timeline at the very least.
You may be giving me too much credit, Jane, but I think, my suggestion with budgeting is that indicating we need to have actual amounts if we're going to have a realistic conversation about budgeting and having input or giving suggestions to the administration with respect for potential inclusion in the governor's recommended budget. And so what I would suggest that would be beneficial for this group to do is to actually identify what the additional budget items are, which in my mind are the remaining statistical and the remaining analyses that the initial cap suggested, and what those analysis would potentially cost to be considered by the committee with respect to prioritization. I don't envision a budget from the council including the actual action steps or substantive work that is contemplated by the cap, but rather those kind of remaining statistical analyses and input that was identified in the initial cap. I don't think there's much remaining there, but there is some. And so that's, I think, what we have to get our arms around with respect to what are the potential costs. Once we have the potential costs of those, that leads to prioritization. So I see the work with respect to process for this group, or rather this committee, is to suggest how those costs are derived, because I don't think this group is in the position to say how much those analyses would cost. So that, to me, that's the work that needs to be done over the summer, so that there are potential costs that can be provided to the committee for prioritization.
So you're recommending that this group, either as a whole or as a subgroup that can sit down and think about it, present what additional analysis they see needs to be done to support that decision-making around the costs, and what would be the price of that additional analysis itself. Is that right?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Any reactions? Seems like a good suggestion, at least as a starting place.
mean,
Yeah, Jared, you're unmuted.
I agree that that type of analysis would be helpful and should be done, and I'm happy to help work on that with others. I guess I would just I don't think that I agree with Secretary Clauser that there shouldn't also be additional investment needs identified by the council beyond research and analysis. I think that because we're in a place where we don't have broad-based policy to do the work of meeting the requirements and, you know, putting those requirements and costs very clearly on the polluting fossil fuel importers, that we're then going to be in a place where we need to identify year by year what is the scale of public investment around incentives, around grants, et cetera, to achieve the level of EV charging infrastructure, of grant funding, low-income weatherization, of, you know, we have a very clear set of pathways in the CAP about what targets we need to meet by 2025 and 2030. If the plan is to add up, and we have good data on where we stand, and I think it will be incumbent on us, if we're not going to have the policies to drive that action and set those requirements on manufacturers, on fossil fuel importers, then we're going to need some analysis about, you know, what is the scale of investment that would be required to get us on those trajectories for consideration by the administration and by the legislature.
Yeah, Julie or Jane?
No, me this time. I just wanted to, a lot of that work, Jared, actually, I think falls to JFO, and I know that they put out a short report earlier this week, and maybe one of the briefings we should ask for as a council is to have JFO come in and walk through their reports, because I don't think that costing piece is actually a charge of the council, but rather that was a directive that was given to JFO.
Really helpful clarification. Great. Well, we've sort of used the time set aside for this. I guess I'm a little nervous about trying to summarize how this all synthesizes into like the next couple of agendas. Can I ask Jane, is the right next step here just to take back the input that we've gotten and try to actually massage that into the next couple of agendas, and then bring it back to the steering committee to see if we need to have some work by steering committee members themselves in between those meetings? It's not clear to me anyway at this point whether that's what it would entail, but I can definitely see coming out of this discussion I can see a clear agenda for several meetings, just in terms of briefings and additional information that the steering committee wants to hear.
Yeah.
What would be your advice?
Yeah, I think there are a number of moving pieces. I think that JFO would likely be happy to come in and do the briefing. I know we're meeting with them later this week to actually learn specifically about their next steps from after this brief report, what they plan to do to expand upon it, and how we can help support each other going forward. So I think that would be a timely conversation to have with the steering committee in a month from now. And as well as just, we should be able to have better updates and timing of considerations of some of the other components that you've spoken about, including the mitigation supply curve by then. And I will say that perhaps one next step, also based on thinking about priorities, would be to use some of the substantive time at the next meeting to review the ongoing technical analyses component of the climate action plan, and think about what has been funded and what hasn't been funded, in order to sort of think about that basis that Secretary Clauser referred to, of like, what are the further actions that need funding to continue to advance.
Okay. Well, unless there's other really pressing comments on this, feels like we need to turn to our next agenda item, which was some updates on the contractual work and particularly some issues on the biomass subgroup. So anything else that people feel like needs to be said before we move on? Okay, thanks. So Jane, this is your gig here. So what did you want to share?
So I just wanted to use this opportunity to advance update the steering committee on the ongoing technical analyses work and where they are, and then use that one component of that to frame up an issue that has come up within the biomass task group, as well as a recommendation in that space. And I know there are other members of the biomass task group who are here today, so do just want to suggest that as we I'll conclude with that component of the update, and then also want to provide space for task group members to turn their camera on and also contribute any comments that they have in that space to my recommendation here. So first, I'll just start with, as you all know, that we've been trying to advance an inordinate amount of RFPs for us within our small central office of the Agency of Natural Resources. There's been some constraints on our agency with significant transition in business office staff over the course of the last few months. So progress has perhaps been a bit slower than we would have liked, but we currently have 2 RFPs posted, one for the Municipal Vulnerability Index, and then one for the life cycle analysis, both of which were the priorities to advance with our remaining GWSA funds. We're also, and I'll come back to the life cycle analysis RFP in a moment, as that one relates most directly with the biomass task group. I will say that we also, as you all know, have received funding to advance the agricultural emissions analysis. We have a draft RFP now for that analysis that internal staff are vetting right now, and then plan to pull together the task group in that space, which is comprised of ag and eco folks and science and data folks, to actually review the RFP before we post it. That likely won't get posted until sometime in July, but we are moving forward with it and working closely with the U.S. Climate Alliance to take in the grant funds for that work. We're also working very closely with the Agency of Transportation to think about, as they stand up a carbon reduction strategy, which is a requirement of taking in a component of the funding for the IIJA, or the otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, to think about how we advance the transportation analysis that the Transportation Task Group has been working on, and how to align that with other analyses that AOT is leading on with respect to look at how they're getting the greenhouse gas, how they can maximize greenhouse gas emission reductions through their capital fund programs. So we're working closely with AOT to think about how to pull together a more comprehensive RFP, and AOT will be sharing that with us, as well as thinking about that with the Transportation Task Group. That will likely mean a broader transportation sector analysis that will be forthcoming in 2023 and not ready for this fall for the transportation recommendations to come to the council with that analysis. So I do just want to highlight that there's existing knowledge that we already have in that space that can help inform the Transportation Task Group recommendations, but the robust analysis that we had hoped to have ready for this fall will not likely be done till fall of 2023. And then finally, we're also working on RFP to further advance the facilitation services that the council uses currently with CBI, but we're actually packaging an RFP that will advance long-term facilitation services for the council, its subcommittees and task group, as well as think about how those services are deployed with our public engagement work. And that RFP is also drafted and will be posted in the coming weeks as well. And hopefully we'll have a new contract in place later this summer for those services as well, knowing that CBI contract is coming to an end in the coming weeks. So going back to the life cycle analysis, I do want to mention that analysis is forthcoming. The RFP is posted through the end of the month. We anticipate having someone on contract in August to begin that work. As we've been working on a scope, which I'm going to drop in the chat, I think I copied it. And then I'm also going to drop in the chat the original biomass. Sorry, I can't multitask here. The second thing I'll put in the chat is, in addition to the proposed scope of the biomass work group, task group, I should say, sorry, we also work to put together a chart that illustrates where the tabled actions are being considered. So you'll all remember that the biomass task group convened because the tabled actions from Ag and Eco, which were agreed Ag and Eco subcommittee to forward on to the council, but Ag and Eco as a subcommittee never reached consensus on these tabled actions. They did reach consensus on putting forward these recommendations to the council. The council decided to table them and form a task group that advanced consensus building around them for both comprised of science and data subcommittee members, cross-sector mitigation members, and Ag and ecosystem members. The first component of that task group was to review those tabled actions, consider what was still within scope of the task group and what perhaps was being covered elsewhere via the life cycle analysis, and or was somewhat settled for now around the adoption of advanced wood heat as a component of the clean heat standard. So that second chart shows how the tabled actions are being considered by the biomass task group. I don't think all of this needs to be digested for this conversation, but did want to alert you to these documents out there if you have any concerns or considerations around them. What I did want to highlight that has been a continual conversation has been what is firmly within scope of this group and how challenging that has been, understanding that a life cycle analysis is moving forward. And I will say that understanding the implications of the life cycle analysis on more than energy per se, in the narrowest sense, we've invited Ag and Eco members to join, and they have joined the life cycle analysis task group. So we have a more diverse group around the table considering that work. That said, what came up in our conversation at the biomass task group the other day was that the definition for the purposes of the biomass task group of what biomass is woody biomass. And that is at the top, the definition being used by this group is at the top of that first document that I put in there. And so what has been firmly considered within scope of this task group is woody biomass, and no other kinds of biomass are being considered right now, AKA biofuels are not being considered by this task group. And the question has come up whether or not biofuels should be considered by this task group. My recommendation is that the life cycle analysis is considering biofuels, and I firmly believe that the life cycle analysis should be completed. And then the council, at the time you have the information from the life cycle analysis, should consider what further recommendations or groups need to be considering recommendations for any of the energy sources we're considering within the life cycle analysis, but appreciating that biofuels is not being covered comprehensively anywhere right now, and was a component of the clean heat standard that raised questions and debate. So my recommendation is that biofuels should be reviewed and studied under the life cycle analysis, and the council 6 months to a year from now should reconsider what biofuels should look like within the place of the climate action plan, and if there's a need to further look at them, but that the biomass task group should continue to move just looking at woody biomass as that task group's jurisdiction right now, as that's what the committee was formed around, and that's what the expertise of that group seems to represent to me. So I wanted to give you that update in the sort of context of all the ongoing contractual work, and highlight the life cycle analysis specifically, but know that the recommendation to all of you is a question around biofuels in this space and whether or not we should reconsider what the scope of this task group is now, or if we feel comfortable deferring the question till we have the additional analysis.
So Liz, I see your hand went up. What would you like to add?
Oh, sure, I can go now. And again, I apologize for being on and off camera. I've got a sick dog. I am sitting on the task group. There are definitely folks who are more expert than me on it. I'll just weigh in, having sat on those meetings, and then I know there are other people on the task group here. Jane, your basic proposal is fine with me, so long as it's almost flipping the definitional question. I mean, I think the task group was formed, you rightly point out, with woody biomass in mind, because so many of the kind of recommendations that had not gained consensus and that the council, I understood, had wanted us to take up were around the operating and of course any proposed, if there were to be any, electric biomass facilities that are woody biomass facilities. So the really good point that has been brought up on that task group is, well, gee, biomass is bigger than that. So maybe what we need to be doing is essentially redefining or naming the task group to make it very clear that that task group is because what I wouldn't want to leave an impression of is that somehow either the council as a whole or the task group specifically is failing to look at a broader set of biomass fuels, because that's not what's happening. What you're saying is the task group was formed with woody biomass in mind. That's the primary task and the set of tabled recommendations that we're working off of. And perhaps that's appropriate and fine, so long as it's staged and understood and expressed. That's how I'm hearing it. In which case, perhaps the task group needs to almost be renamed or redefined so that we feel okay, as it were, going forward with that scope understood. I'll stop there.
And as I understand it, what Jane is also saying is, yes, that scope would be limited for now, but the other biomass questions,
Right,
or issues would be raised later.
it's a
through a-
sequencing issue.
Yes,
That's right.
yeah.
And perhaps, and it may or may not be this task group, because I mean, the task group, I think you're right, was formed, like, I know I'm sitting on it because I hold the utility seat, and the utilities are part owners in one facility and contractors for another. So, you know, there's an interest there. We have woody biomass experts. So I agree that a different set of questions on a different set of biofuels might require different members, I would think, at least possibly.
Mhm.
Okay.
And Judy, yeah, I know you sit on that task group as well. What did you want to add?
Yes, thank you. I guess our conversations on this committee has crossed over to biofuels many times, of course, because biomass is biofuel. And I do agree that it should be part of the scope for the Ag and Ecosystem Committee, or the Biomass Committee Task Force, to discuss. However, I think there needs to be more representation from the Ag, because this was a discussion that was very lengthy in our subcommittee, and we seem to have 3/4 of the amount of people that the other subcommittees have. So I think it's important to add new people to the subcommittee and tackle some of those people. There's a lot of knowledgeable people who have been coming to our meetings, and I think they should sit on this committee. They should be a part of it and also a part of the discussion. And I'm also a little concerned about comments that I've heard here today, things like the action plan stands as it is. For me, it's traditional to adapt, and adaptation is traditional adaptation to social, political, economic, and environmental changes. As the time goes on, if we don't adapt, we're never going to get this right. There has to be some traditional ecological knowledge included within this, and there has to be some understanding that economy cannot go first. We will never have a healthy economy if we do not have a healthy land. We have to have healthy land first and then work on the healthy economy. And so I think things are a little backwards, and they need to be shifted around. There has to be some understanding around traditional ecological knowledge. It has to be braided together with Western science. And this is a perfect example. If you're going to put economy first and take a fossil fuel economy and change it for a biofuel economy, you have to understand the implications of that. And it impacts the land greatly. And if that's not considered, and equity is not considered as the guiding principles state, then there's a serious problem here. It will never be right, and it'll get voted down again. There's a lot of issues that are missing in that clean heat standard, and they need to be addressed this time. They need to move forward. I think it was Jared that said, not just move forward, but to look at what went wrong. We have to look at that. There were a lot of voices that clearly some people heard, and that's why the veto did not get passed. And we need to start looking at those voices and listening to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And, I'm hearing you have a specific kind of action item, which would be to expand this task force membership to include more ag and ecosystem members from the prior subcommittee. So I'm wondering if that's something we can take up when we talk about either, I don't know where that happens, whether it happens with the first of all, the task group bringing that forward to the steering committee as a whole. Before we were discussion.
That's what we were told. We were also, okay. There's a second component to that. The second component is to add biofuels to the discussion of the biomass task force. Because it's crossing over all the time in our discussions now.
Right.
And, so it's twofold. And we were told to go to the steering committee first, which is why I'm here.
So you would actually want that to be, not wait for the life cycle analysis to come forward for more information about the role of biofuels overall. You want to see that part of the discussion now as part of the task group scope.
Exactly.
That would be a change to the task group scope as it's currently written.
Exactly, because as Jane put in the chat box, it's probably going to be 9 months. So if we don't have this discussion between now and the next 9 months, it's going to be up in legislation again. And there's a whole component that's going to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, or absent.
Let me take some other comments. Chris, let me hear from you next. And then Liz, your hand's still up if you still want to weigh in after that.
Yes, I guess a question for Jane. I'm sorry if I missed this somehow. So I'm looking at the biomass proposed scope for the task group. And I guess is it only limited to power generation? Because that's the way it is reading to me. And then the other question is there any limit to the geographic scope of the source of the wood? Because to my mind, that second question is key too.
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking with the second question quite yet, but I will say that the way that scope was written was to change the predetermined outcome of the recommendations from Ag and Eco into an active voice, so that they were the ones that were firmly within scope still of that group were exploratory, so that we could be moving forward around what do we want to say about existing facilities and what do we want to say about procurement of the wood and management around wood that is sourced for those facilities. I think we have come into some question around commerce law has actually come up around what we can say about the management of forests or biomass procured outside of Vermont. So if that's what you're asking, specifically, we're talking about, first off, just to be clear, is my understanding from, and I have seen other ag folks on this call, so please happily correct me if I'm wrong. There are no biofuels created in Vermont except for used veggie oil is what I've been told. And so we do not have a biofuel production in Vermont. So it's versus biomass, which is clearly, we have lots of wood in Vermont that we're cutting and using for both home heating and electricity. So they are different in that capacity. But maybe, Chris, if you want to ask me a more detailed question about the second thing that you were asking. If I didn't.
Yeah. So I guess, and even going back to the first one, I guess what I'm confused about is, are we also talking about biomass primarily for thermal, for heat generation, as opposed to for electric generation? Because to my mind, the two things are different. Even our regional plan, we treat the two things as different. So so what's the answer to the first one first? Is that?
Yeah, we're largely, because advanced wood heat was put forward as a strategy in the clean heat standard.
Yeah.
We thought about first tackling with electricity. I don't want to say that it's not, it all gets tied together a little bit, but we are thinking specifically about biomass for electricity.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on the geographic question, to my mind too, this is both the sustainability and the when it gets to the total, the life cycle analysis. I guess I was thinking not just Vermont, but probably northern New England, potentially New York, limiting the geography to that because if we're talking about the is it the energy footprint of like continuing to chew up southeastern bottomland hardwood forests to fuel electricity in Vermont, that's a different story than fitting in wood sourced in Vermont, elsewhere in northern New England, as part of kind of overall forest management practices, to support, to see how that pencils out when it comes to electrical generation, or in my world, preferably, heat generation. But that's why I was asking about the geography, because I guess it's very different, right? Because a lot of the pellets like generated in the Southeast are going overseas. That's a different calculus than say Southeast bottomland hardwood forests, a lot of those ecosystems for domestic consumption or even regional consumption. But
and it does sound like, at least based on Jane's response, that the geographic scope of procurement is already an issue, one that has to be considered outside of the boundaries of New York. So it sounds like that is definitely within scope of this. There is a question I see. I'm cognizant of the time running fast, and we do have this proposal put forward by Judy to consider. But I don't know if this is helpful for answering that question for others, but there was a question in chat about what the life cycle analysis will cover. And since that is what potentially we would wait to get in order to inform further discussion of other biofuels, can somebody answer that? Does it include more than just greenhouse gas emission?
That's the intent of it, is greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. So here's where I will have to ask for your help, Jane, in terms of how decision-making of this group moves forward when you have, a proposal or two alternative proposals. Do you guys take a vote? Do we just ask if there's...
The first, I just want to address Judy's comment about composition of the task group. And you've probably all seen in the chat, the task group is currently comprised of 3 Ag and Eco subcommittee reps, 2 cross-sector and 2 from science and data right now. And so that is currently, and the subcommittees themselves can nominate others to join, but we've decided that the task group can only be subcommittee members current. So the folks, Judy, that you've alluded to, who continually come to the meetings, Ag and Eco as a subcommittee could consider putting them forward as additional subcommittee members and then appointing them to the task group possibly but they're not on a subcommittee right now, so they are not, we're only looking at subcommittee members on this task group. I'll pause there, Judy, and go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Jane, but what I was asking is that we haven't had an ag and ecosystems meeting, and you were going to talk to Billy about setting one up. And because of that, we haven't been able to fill the slots on the ag and ecosystem subcommittee. So we're very reduced compared to the other subcommittees. And so there's no one to select from because everybody's already been given the choice and has said no. So we've got to get this committee meeting happening so that we can do that. We can do exactly that.
So I appreciate that. I will say that the task group will also need to make a decision if they want more representation from ag and eco as the next step, only because currently the task group has more representation from ag and eco than the other two subcommittees participating. So
Right.
there could be additional, but that would also be a task group decision around how many people are going to be on the task group, because the intent is to keep these groups small and actively moving work forward in the name of subcommittees where decisions are ultimately made. But I agree, and I understand that Billy and Abby have discussed having a meeting, and I don't know what that outcome is of that conversation because I haven't circled. I just know that they've talked, don't know what they've decided though.
Right. And I understand all that. But what I'm saying is this was a topic that was discussed at our meeting at great lengths over and over and over and over again. And all of these people were present at these meetings.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So maybe it just stay tuned for an upcoming meeting around ag and eco for some decision around in that space. My second comment, I know that around the actual decision making of how to deal with biofuels. I see you made the comment that biofuels already being grown in Vermont, and I appreciate that. I could have been most misspoken in that term, so don't want to create the image that I am 100% certain in. So I completely appreciate that. As far as my recommendation though for how to deal with biofuels, I'd like the way that this group normally works is I would like to proceed with the recommendation that I have on the table in the agenda, which is that biofuels is something that council should consider once we have the life cycle analysis completed. And that the scope of this task group should stay as woody biomass as the main option. And then we would reconsider how biofuels are dealt with in the future 6 to 9 months when we have the life cycle analysis back to make a more informed decision. And if anybody on the steering committee has a challenge to that recommendation or would like to put forward an alternative recommendation, I'm happy to hear that.
So we want a sense of the group on the standing proposal that Jane just outlined. Is there anybody that I guess anybody on the steering committee who is opposed to that approach? Usually easier to identify it that way. Do you typically raise your hand, either your virtual hand? That would help me if there is anybody who has any opposition, to raise your virtual hand so I can see it. Okay.
Catherine, it's Liz. I as I said before, I'm okay and would agree with what's been put forward. I would just want to make certain that the task group gets the information from the steering committee, if appropriate, that it really is a sequencing issue, because I think Judy and others have brought up really important points. So I wouldn't, like I said before, want the impression to be otherwise. And that might require like the task group to be, very specifically narrowly defined rather than what we've done so far, which is like define terms, you know what I mean? Like it's a little bit of a flip. By defining biomass the way that we have, I wouldn't want it to be thought that somehow the Climate Council as a whole is skipping this issue. So we may need to do something express on that.
Okay, so I hear you, Liz, and it sounds like through some mechanism, whatever is most appropriate, that needs to be conveyed to the task group, either a combination through a change of name and a clarification of its scope, that it is really focused on woody biomass for electricity sector. I'm getting a little feedback. And that subsequently other biofuels issues will be taken up once the life cycle analysis is
That many pieces, right? Nothing
completed.
Or anything goofy. Okay.
So with that, can we quickly turn to the subcommittee members? Do we have enough time? Can we hold folks for that? I think we have a few new
Yeah.
subcommittee members.
Yeah, briefly, I'm going to drop it in the chat so you all have the link. Oh, da, da. So as actually Judy just alluded to, all of the subcommittees have new membership currently. I will share my screen briefly just to orient you to it. The subcommittees have been moving forward and thinking about new membership, largely to staff much of the implementation work and think about transitions that have been occurring. Some of the ones I'd like to highlight for you in particular is with Commissioner Walk stepping down from his role at DEC. We needed a new co-chair for cross-sector subcommittee, and that position was an executive branch co-chair position. So TJ Poore, on behalf of Commissioner Tierney, will co-chair cross-sector mitigation going forward with your approval. I believe we've dealt with, I should highlight that we've dealt with the Just Transition membership changes at the last time you met. So right now we're really focused on the changes to cross-sector mitigation, changes to resilience and adaptation, and the changes to science and data. And so with TJ leaving science and data, Megan O'Toole will stepping in as co-chair for science and data. And then there's a laundry list of additional expertise on all three of those subcommittees. In cross-sector mitigation, I will highlight that Adam Sherman is recommended to join. He brings actually experience with biomass, and he had been nominated a number of times to join science and data, but because cross-sector mitigation has less capacity to deal with the biomass task group, it made sense for him to join cross-sector and then be a liaison back to cross-sector. In rural resilience, there are 4 new members, starting with Val Story on this list and going down to Alice. They all bring varying expertise from housing to energy to town planning. And then a number of members down at the bottom, additional staff capacity with COVID lightening up, perhaps. Jared Ulmer and David Grass, who are climate program managers within the Vermont Department of Health, have renewed capacity to engage with the Climate Council work that they didn't have over the last year. So they're joining both capacity in rural resilience, as well as Jared Ulmer is actually a member of, a recommended member for science and data. So starting with Claire, who's now joining science and data as the rep from PSD, and then going all the way down to Una Darrell. There's additional expertise with life cycle analysis, a lot of folks who bring expertise around resilience metrics to help with the tool in the coming year, and others, sustainability from UVM to bring additional capacity to science and data. So I know I just want to highlight the overall theme is that subcommittees are getting bigger, not smaller. And so that's largely to have folks who are really leaning in and doing the good work of the climate action plan implementation that we need, and just carrying forward the scope and scale of the ask. So I'll stop there if people have specific questions. Otherwise, hopefully these have all been vetted by the subcommittees, and all the subcommittees are really excited about moving forward with them.
So no questions? And if not, I just would ask, is there any objections to endorsement of this slate of new subcommittee members? All right, we're good to go on that.
And then just before I lose quorum, I'll just say we have, we typically meet once a month. I can work with you all on that specific scheduling for July and August offline. But just wanted to make sure that once a month makes sense, which it seems like it does based on the agenda we discussed earlier today for work planning. And unless I hear any problems, I'll stick with this time slot on Mondays and just work to get the best Monday for you all for July and August.
Thanks, Jane. Anybody who can stick around for a few minutes, we don't want to give short shrift to the public comment. So we want to open it up for public comment for those of you who've joined us outside of the steering committee. So anyone has a comment that would like to raise it now. See two hands. Cheryl. Let me call on you first, and I have to get my glasses. Oh, on my head. Well, let me call on you first. Oh, can you unmute yourself?
I had been unmuted,
There
but
you
then
go.
it got muted again. I did have, and I do have a lot to say, but the people aren't here anymore, and it's after 1 o'clock, after the close of the meeting, again, which happens on a regular basis. And additionally, the things that the public says, even though they are well educated and experienced in a lot of these things, is disregarded. I suppose perhaps not disregarded when it's at a different meeting designed for the public, but still disregarded then as well. And I'm not going to say the things that I need to say about the content of the meeting because people aren't here to hear it. And I'm not going to just talk to vent. I can vent with my friends and colleagues. And that's it. And you're going to have the same issue with the clean heat standard and other things going forward if you don't start listening to people and start doing things that matter. So that's it. I'm pretty bothered by the process here. And I'm not thanking anybody this time.
Well, my apologies because I let this go over.
No,
as a
Catherine.
substitute facilitator.
No, it's not. It's been happening forever, and it's not just you. And you're new here as well. So it's been
Well, I
happening from the beginning.
I appreciate that the public does need, it's an opportunity, a fulsome opportunity to be heard on these meetings. Senator Bray.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon now. So I just wanted to say thanks. I've been listening in, and there's a lot of work to do. And I'm just appreciative that people are working and thinking about next legislative session. I have a campaign to run between now and then, but if I'm reelected, I certainly want to continue to work on these things. And it's great to have a much larger group of informed people thinking and bringing good information forward to the legislature, which has a very narrow window to actually work on these things. And legislative session seems long sometimes to people outside, but the actual pace within the building is very short. So it's great that so much information is being developed, thought through to put us in a better place once the legislature reconvenes. So I'm saying my bottom line message is thank you.
And thank you for that comment. Ken Jones.
Yeah, thanks for taking my comment. This is, while I have many roles in the Climate Council, but this I think is representing kind of a public comment, and that while the impacts of climate change continue to grow at a steady rate, the thing that's happening this year that I need to put an exclamation point on is the economic impact of price change. And while I know many of the policies we've talked about have possible price tags in the tens of millions of dollars, Vermonters are going to spend close to $1 billion more in fossil fuels in 2022 than they did prior to COVID. And I bring that up not just to raise an alarm, but rather to recognize that as we head into the next heating season, people are going to make choices. And the extent to which the Climate Council and the many partners associated with it can help people make choices to reduce their fossil fuel use will have a much greater audience that's ready to hear that sort of information. And I'll just use one example. tens of thousands of people have installed heat pumps, but they don't necessarily install them to heat their homes. And so working with the electric utilities and working with the installers to really help people optimize their use of heat pumps for the coming heating season can make a difference. And so I know we talk about the long-term policies, but I hope there can be some effort to really taking this time of very high fuel oil, propane, natural gas prices to help Vermonters make a difference in their fossil fuel consumption. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And it looks like our last comment is Kai McKell-Forley.
Sorry, working on getting everything turned on here.
That works. I hear you.
I will post my comments, or attempting to post them in the written in the chat, but I'll also just state them out loud. And that is, let me just read this real quick. 2 points. First, I've recently stumbled upon anecdotal evidence that some not insignificant number of owners / users of cold climate heat pumps are not satisfied with their equipment for various reasons. Overall BT usage, post-installation being higher than pre-installation, overall energy costs being higher post-installation than they were led to believe, insufficient heat output, concern that maybe the investment wasn't worth it. And B, that no one is meaningfully tracking, and by no one, I mean no state agency, no municipal agency, no utility, no installer group, no environmental group is meaningfully tracking actual user experiences with this equipment. There's a lot of projection out there in the tracking world, if you will, projecting what usage for a certain piece of equipment over a less efficient piece of equipment will be, but it's all, for the most part, appears to be largely make-believe. Knowing that placing an emphasis on convincing consumers to adopt this technology detracts from the far more meaningful work of super insulating homes and businesses. It's always more bang for the buck to work on the demand side of things. An effort that at present doesn't exist at the municipal, state, or federal level, and knowing that undertaking this kind of essential work isn't nearly as easy or as sexy as installing a shiny new cold climate heat pump, my fear is that ratepayers and the public are being sold a bill of goods that isn't actually grounded in verifiable data, and that instead all we're doing is making ourselves feel good while facilitating the profits of installers and manufacturers at the expense of consumers and ratepayers. Putting this in more basic terms, how is installing a shiny new cold climate heat pump in horribly performing structures? For instance, how many homes and businesses in the state rely on 2x4 walls? Not simply putting lipstick on a pig, no offense to the pig. Second, biomass as a green fuel source category is a proven fallacy. Please don't buy into the nonsense being pushed by industry and others who seek to mask our detrimental effect on the climate. 8 billion people burning literally anything is a recipe for our own demise. Our focus absolutely needs to be on reducing demand by, for instance, super insulating every home and business in the state before we denude our forests, pushing wood heat, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
And thank you and the others for hanging on and waiting to give us your comments. I think it's always helpful to hear how you're experiencing this on the ground and the impacts it's having there. So really appreciate you holding on, and my apologies for letting the meeting run long. So that's it for this agenda. And it sounds like what we will be coming back with the steering committee with is at least some suggested draft agendas for the next 2 or 3 meetings, if we can pull that together for you, and based on your input today. And it also that I want to thank Judy Dow. I know she's signed off, but for bringing forward some of the alternative positions on the biomass subgroup, so that the steering committee could take that up as well. So with that, have a good week all, and we'll sign off.
Thanks for pinch hitting, Catherine. Excellent job. Sure. Have a great afternoon.